Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a time before supermarkets, before bagged bread and gluten-free options. Back when your daily loaf could make or break your reputation, your livelihood, even your freedom. It's pitch dark when you step into the cobbled streets of a medieval English town. The air is damp, the only sound is the soft clatter of hooves on stone, and the faint orange glow of oven fires flickers through the cracks of wooden shutters. You follow your nose, the warm, earthy scent of yeast, flour, and ambition drifting through alleys still slick with dew. Bakers are already awake, long before the sun. You might think they're just early risers, but no, these men and women are working under a different kind of pressure. They're not just trying to make a good crust, they're trying to avoid public humiliation, financial ruin, or even a stint in the pillory, because somewhere out there, an official is waiting to weigh their bread. The bread assize is coming, and if your loaves are too light, if they're too pricey, if you added just a little extra bran to stretch your flour, well, let's just say you probably wouldn't survive this as a side hustle. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to hear where you re-listening from tonight. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pass through a narrow lane toward the bakery district where carts filled with sacks of flour are being unloaded. The sacks are marked with symbols instead of letters. Most people can't read, but they know a local miller's mark when they see it. Someone grunts as he drags a sack inside, nodding at you but not stopping. There's no time for chatter. The ovens are already hot and the dough must rise. You slip into the back of a small stone bakery, low-ceilinged and already coated with flour. A baker you'll come to know simply as Thomas is elbow-deep in dough. He wipes his forehead with a floured wrist and mutters about the rain making his yeast unpredictable. Outside, his apprentice is chopping wood for the oven, the smell of smoke curling through the cracks in the door. There's a nervousness here you can't quite place. The work is steady, practiced, but the mood is tense. And that S when you spot the slate board hanging near the door, it shows the official weight and price allowed for bread this week. These numbers are determined by the Assize, and they're not just suggestions, they're law. The price of bread isn't set by the baker or the market. It's dictated by a national system, one of the oldest consumer protection laws in English history. The logic is simple. If wheat is scarce and prices rise, bread must stay affordable. If flour is abundant, bakers still can't hike up the price. The punishment for breaking this rule? Public shame, fines, or worse. Historians still argue whether this strict price control system was designed more to protect peasants or to maintain civic control, but either way, it meant that bakers were the ones squeezed in the middle. Flour gets expensive, but bread prices can't rise. Guess who takes the hit? And it's not just about price. Bread must meet strict weight requirements too. If your loaf is underweight even by an ounce, you're in trouble. But overcompensate too much and you lose profits. It's a delicate dance between survival and submission. You watch Thomas scoop dough onto a wooden board. He eyes the amount, then adds a pinch more. He's not taking chances. Later, he'll slice one open to check for air pockets. He'll compare its heft to a metal weight he keeps hidden in a drawer. Not because he's obsessive, but because the wrong guess could ruin his month. Here's something quirky. Medieval bakers sometimes used coins or lead weights to check their loaves. They'd even bake a test loaf and break it open just to be sure. The fear was real, and with good reason. Outside, the sun is finally rising, casting orange light over the town's high stone walls and crooked timber buildings. You pass other bakeries, each one bustling with activity. Horses clop past, pulling carts of ale, fish, and salted meat. But everyone, even the merchants, glances at the bakeries. Bread is the day's anchor. And soon so are the inspectors. But for now, you settle into the morning rhythm. The slap of dough, the crackle of fire, and the undercurrent of dread as every baker prepares for judgment. You stay in the shadows of the bakery a little longer, watching as the day sharpens into form. The first loaves are going into the oven now, round, heavy, dusted with flour, their tops scored with a practiced flick of a knife. There's a rhythm to all this, but it's not peaceful, it's more like bracing for impact. You can feel it in the way Thomas glances at the clockwork spit of light creeping across the wall, measuring how long until the inspectors arrive. You duck out the back and follow the flour trail into the storeroom. The air here is dry and gritty. Sacks of milled grain are stacked like little tombs, each one representing not just raw material, but risk. Thomas is in here now, weighing his flour again. This is the third time since sunrise. His apprentice watches nervously, clearly unsure if this is normal baker behavior or some personal ritual of paranoia. Here's what's really going on. Under the Assize of bread and ale, every baker is expected to conform to a strict set of proportions. Price, weight, and even the fineness of the flour had to line up with government regulations. And while that might sound like a reasonable public service, ensuring nobody gets shortchanged on their daily calories, it was also a trap. Imagine trying to make a perfect loaf with inconsistent tools. The scales might be off, the flour might be coarser than usual, the heat of the fire might bake one side faster than the other. It's not like they had digital thermometers or high-tech ovens. They had guesswork, experience, and sometimes just plain luck. That's why, as you step closer, you see Thomas muttering under his breath and watching the balance like it's a loaded crossbow. If he overshoots, he loses money. Undershoot, and he risks public shame. The balance trembles, and finally he lets out a sigh. "Close enough," he says. But you notice he checks it twice more before turning away. The town is waking up now. You wander out into the main street where carts trundle by, laden with onions, root vegetables, and small baskets of eggs. You catch the occasional waft of cheese or dried fish, pungent in the early heat. Over near the fountain, a market boy yells prices at passing townsfolk, all of them eyeing the bread stalls with hungry anticipation. Here's the thing people often forget. Bread was the main food group. For most people, it wasn't a side dish, it was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And if your baker got the measurements wrong, it wasn't just annoying. It could mean you didn't eat enough that day, or that the bread went moldy too fast, or that you'd get sick. And yet, the regulations never really accounted for human error, or bad harvests, or changing oven temperatures. You pass another bakery, this one quieter, run by a short, round woman named Maud with thick forearms and a face like week-old dough. She doesn't see you, but she's hard at work, brushing the tops of her loaves with something that looks suspiciously shiny. Curious, you slip closer. It's lard, rendered fat. She's using it to make the crust glisten and stay moist longer. It's not strictly forbidden, but depending on the local Assize enforcement, it could be considered an enhancement that changes the loaf's expected cost or weight. Tricky, right? Here's a fringe tidbit. Some bakers, especially in secretive towns, added things like mashed beans, ground peas, or even powdered chalk to their flour to bulk it up. Not to poison people, though it sometimes had that effect, but just to stretch a sack of flour a bit farther. And when things got really desperate, you'd hear whispers about sawdust. Of course, not every town enforced the bread Assize the same way. In some places, inspectors turned a blind eye, in others they showed up with iron scales and sour expressions, and if your bread didn't pass, they made a very public example of you. Historians still argue whether the Assize was a genuine attempt to keep markets fair or just another form of control, a way for those in power to police the poor under the guise of protecting them. The truth is, probably somewhere in the middle, but for the people living under it, like Thomas and Maud, it didn't matter. The Assize was law, and the law didn't care if your oven bricks cracked from the heat or your flour had weevils. Back in Thomas's shop, the loaves are out of the oven. He picks up each one, weighing it with his hands first, then again on the scale. His shoulders sag a little with each good result. He's gotten better at this. He's survived a dozen inspections. But even now, a mistake could undo everything. And this fear? This hovering tension you feel in every gesture, every glance at the door? It'll only build from here, because today, the Bread Assize inspectors are coming. You don't need a trumpet blast to know when the Bread Assize is about to strike. It starts with silence. The street slows down. Vendors murmur to each other and quickly adjust their carts. A child drops a turnip and scurries behind his mother. You feel it like a breeze before a storm. Nervous glances, clenched jaws, floury hands suddenly wiped clean on aprons. Then you see them, two officials round the corner like the world's least fun parade, draped in wool cloaks despite the rising heat, one carrying a scroll, the other lugging a pair of iron weights like they're sacred relics. No smiles, no hellos, just grim purpose. The Bread Assize has arrived. They head straight for Thomas's bakery. You follow, of course. He barely has time to set down his knife before the scroll is unrolled and the first words are spoken. Hear ye, by ordinance of the Assize, the loaves of Thomas son of Gregory shall be measured and marked this day. Thomas bows, not too low, not too stiff. Just the right blend of submission and professionalism. He gestures toward the cooling shelf. You can see the beads of sweat forming along his hairline that have nothing to do with oven heat. One official pulls out a small iron weight smoothed by time and use. The other selects a loaf. It's warm, smells heavenly, and looks, well, pretty perfect. But this isn't a bakery review. This is an inquisition. They place the loaf on a balance scale, countered by the official weight. The scale dips, then steadies, balanced. Thomas doesn't exhale, but you feel the whole bakery breathe with relief. One down. Here's a bit of context. The Assize of bread and ale originated in 13th century England under Henry III and was one of the earliest consumer protection laws in the Western world. Its rules were updated constantly, trying to reflect changing grain prices and market conditions. But the logic was inflexible. Bread had to match a certain weight and cost ratio, regardless of the flour's quality or what weird weather the local millers were blaming for bad grain. And that iron weight? It was no symbolic prop. Officials travelled with an entire kit of calibrated stones used to weigh loaves with excruciating precision. Too light, and it didn't matter if it was perfectly baked or lovingly shaped. You'd violated the law. One loaf, however, is not enough. The officials inspect a second loaf. This one has a tiny crack in the crust and feels lighter in your hands. Thomas knows it too. You watch his face pale as they place it on the scale. This time, it teeters. The official raises an eyebrow. The assistant scribes something onto the parchment. Thomas swallows. "The dough was wetter this morning," he says quickly. "Humidity in the flour. I compensated, but..." The official doesn't reply. He simply nods to the scribe again. You glance around. Everyone in the bakery has stopped moving. The apprentices are frozen mid-sweep. Maud from across the street peeks through her curtain like she's watching a hanging. Why the tension? Because this isn't just a slap on the wrist. If the Bread Assize finds a pattern of underweight loaves, or if they believe it's deliberate, Thomas could be fined, flogged, or locked in the pillory. Ah yes, the pillory. That charming wooden frame with holes for your head and hands where passers-by could throw rotten vegetables, or worse. Imagine being paraded in front of the people who buy your bread with a sign around your neck reading, "Cheated his neighbours." Not a great marketing strategy. Here's a quirky historical note. Some bakers tried to bribe officials with extra loaves hidden under cloth, or in gifts of sweet buns for their children. Others would hire criers to loudly read the Assize rules outside their bakery each week, as a way to demonstrate compliance, whether true or not. But the inspectors aren't interested in sweet buns today. They check one final loaf. This one thankfully passes. The scribe folds the scroll, and the iron weights are repacked with ritual slowness. No penalty is declared, but that one scribbled line will go into the town ledger. If Thomas is flagged again, there will be consequences. Historians still argue whether these inspections genuinely kept the peace or were just a performance, bread theatre, if you will, to maintain order in towns where hunger could turn deadly. Either way, the impact is real. The officials leave, and for a moment it's like the bakery sags. Thomas sits down hard on a stool, his apron grey with flour and stress. You wonder, how many times can someone live like this? Constant vigilance, constant fear, for something as humble as a loaf of bread? Outside, the town resumes its rhythm, but for the bakers, the inspection lingers, like the smell of burnt crust. You return the next morning, just as the sun drags its gold across the rooftops and the ovens yawn open once again. But this time, something's different. There's a quiet edge to Thomas's movements, a stiffness in how he kneads the dough. You hear him mutter, half an ounce, and they nearly pilloried me. You're starting to understand. In a world where most people can't afford meat, cheese, or ale every day, bread isn't just food, it's survival. And in this system, a half ounce of missing crust can cost a baker everything. Outside, the townsfolk are already beginning to gather. Bread sells fast in the morning, and if you're late, you'll get the dark, crusty leftovers or nothing at all. Some people bring their own cloth to wrap their loaves, others sniff each one, inspecting for mold or underbaking. A woman ahead of you shakes her head at one of Thomas's loaves and grumbles, "Light again!" He hears her, doesn't say anything, but you can see the sting behind his eyes. Reputation travels faster than smoke in this town. You drift to the edge of the crowd where a boy is explaining to his friend how to test a loaf by bouncing it on his palm. If it thumps too much, it's hollow, he says, like he's describing a rotten melon. It's half folk wisdom, half real quality control, passed down like superstition. And in a way it is. The Assize of bread has created a town full of amateur inspectors, each with their own theory about what makes a true loaf. And if they don't trust yours, they'll walk right over to the next baker, or worse, they'll report you. That's why Thomas is still sweating, even after passing most of yesterday's inspection. One bad review on the street can do just as much damage as a visit from the officials, and it only gets trickier. See, the bread Assize doesn't just care about weight, it cares about price. You glance at the chalkboard nailed to Thomas's doorway. It shows the weekly bread rates. Today's price for a 1-penny white loaf is fixed, and so is the weight it must reach. But flour prices, those aren't fixed at all. If the miller raises his price due to a bad harvest, Thomas still has to sell his bread at the same government-mandated rate. So what does he do? He cheats. Just a little. This is where it gets delicate. Bakers might accidentally use cheaper flour, mix rye into wheat, or increase the water content in dough to make it spread further. Some even mold the dough differently, making it taller, fluffier, with big airy holes inside. It looks big, feels light, weighs just enough to pass. You catch Thomas trying this exact move, pressing the dough more gently, allowing bigger air pockets to form as it rises. Is it dishonest, or just survival? Historians still argue whether medieval bakers were truly dishonest or simply adaptive, shaped by impossible demands and fluctuating grain prices. Some records paint them as conniving, while others show bakers constantly fined for offences like Overbaking, underselling, or delivering loaves that taste of clay? Yes, clay. Some bakers really did that. You step into the bakery again just as Thomas pulls a loaf from the oven. The crust cracks audibly, steam curling into the ceiling like a ghost escaping. He turns it in his hands, knocks on the bottom. He's listening for the drum-like hollow sound that tells him it's baked through. You can see the relief on his face when it answers back. And then he does something odd. He slices it open, not for a customer, not for show, but just to check. Inside, the crumb is pale and soft, pocked with uneven holes. It's not beautiful, but it's passable. He exhales, brushes the crumbs from the blade, and sets it aside. Now imagine doing that 20 times a day. Every loaf, every batch, a gamble. Here's a curious little fact. In some regions, bakers baked a single extra loaf with every dozen, what we now call a baker's dozen. But it wasn't generosity, it was fear. That 13th loaf was the insurance policy, the safety buffer, in case one of the other 12 came up short when the Assize came knocking. Thomas does this too. You watch him tuck a single plain bun into a basket beside the others, muttering, "Better safe than pilloried." It's almost like a ritual, a superstition, a prayer in the form of carbs. You head back into the street where another baker, this one younger, cockier, is boasting about how his loaves never get checked. "They love me at the Assize," he smirks. "Gave 'em some of my wife's spiced ale at Christmas." His companion chuckles. You note the weight on his shoulder, something smug and dangerous. Bribes were common, or at least rumours of them were. Offer an official a few silver pennies or a bottle of something strong, and your waits might just pass unnoticed. That doesn't mean you're safe, though. If the townsfolk complain loudly enough, even a bribed inspector will have to act. So here in the town square, the fear hangs thick as flour dust. Because anyone, your rival, your neighbour, your customer's 10-year-old nephew, can become your undoing. As the week stretches on, you begin to notice a new layer of unease beneath the crusty calm. The tension doesn't just come from the officials or the town gossip, it comes from the bakers themselves. You wander past a side alley and see two of them arguing in hushed tones, eyes darting toward the street like schoolboys caught cheating during mass. You eavesdrop, of course. The older baker, his apron soaked and sagging, is warning the younger one about that trick with the hollow center. Says it's too risky. Says the Assize's scales are getting sharper. Says someone down the road got caught last week and they're still scraping the old guy's name off his shop sign. The younger one shrugs, unconvinced. "If you bake by the book, you'll starve by the book," he says. That's the catch, isn't it? The Assize expects perfection, but the market punishes caution. And so many bakers start to get creative. Some of these little innovations are harmless, tweaks to baking time, subtle shaping differences, but others are borderline dangerous. You step into a shop near the river where the smell hits you like a club. Not bad exactly, just odd. The baker here is kneading dough with something greyish folded in. You lean closer. Ground beans. It's a known trick. Dried beans, crushed into powder, can bulk up flour and cut costs. The texture is off, sure, and the bread goes stale faster, but it meets weight. Sometimes, on a good day, if the humidity cooperates, you glance over to a customer biting into a crusty roll. She pauses, chews with effort, then shrugs and buys 3 more. It's not that people love the taste, it's that they don't have options. In famine years, or when grain imports are delayed by weather or war, this kind of bread becomes the norm. What we'd consider filler, beans, barley, even ground peas, was often what kept entire towns alive. Or at least not entirely dead. Of course, not all substitutions were harmless. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. There are records of bakers who mixed in chalk, lime, or alum to artificially whiten their bread. It made loaves look more expensive, white bread being the luxury choice of the upper class, but consuming it regularly could lead to digestive nightmares and worse. Historians still debate how widespread these practices really were. Some insist they were rare outliers, urban legends, exaggerated by suspicious customers. Others believe they were far more common than we like to admit, quiet compromises made in desperation. You step out of the Riverside Bakery and wander toward the grain market. It's midday now, hot and buzzing with argument. Flour merchants are haggling with bakers, holding up sample bags of grain like auctioneers showing off pearls. One merchant, red-faced and sweating, insists that a recent mill collapse has driven prices up. "If you want white flour," he shouts, "you pay double or go without." A baker throws his hands up. "Then the Assize should double my prices too." But it won't. The bread Assize is not flexible. It does not care if your flour shipment fell in a river. It doesn't care if a freak hailstorm flattened the wheat fields. It only cares that the official table of weights and prices be followed precisely, religiously. That's why some bakers, especially the more daring ones, start tampering with the baking process itself. You duck into a small workshop behind a bakery where a man named Gilbert is working a second oven. This one is oddly shaped, tall and narrow. "I bake the bread upside down," he explains proudly. "It keeps the air bubbles high in the center, so it passes the weight test, but uses less dough." You admire the creativity, though you're not sure the Assize would. Gilbert grins as he cracks open a loaf, showing you the hollow dome inside. "Looks good, right?" he says. Weighs right, too. You ask what happens if the inspectors catch on. His grin vanishes. "Then I'm just another dishonest baker on the town scroll, and I lose my oven, my stall, and probably my teeth when the crowd gets bored." That's the other layer of this punishment system, public spectacle. See, medieval justice wasn't just about fines or imprisonment, it was about theatre, and nothing drew a crowd like a shamed baker. Imagine this: you're strapped into a wooden pillory in the town square, arms and neck locked in place, sun baking your scalp, while children toss pebbles and cabbage at your feet. Above your head hangs a sign: "Sold light loaves, stole from the poor." It doesn't matter that you were trying to feed your family, that the flour was poor, that the fire was weak. You've become the lesson, the warning, the bread-shaped scapegoat, even worse. Sometimes the punishment wasn't immediate. Inspectors might record your violation, report it to the guild, and return in 3 days with judgment, which means you'd spend those 3 days baking under the knowledge that your fate was already sealed. You stroll back toward Thomas's bakery, where he's just closing up. His basket of leftover rolls is smaller than usual, but he looks tired, not angry. He waves you in and pours a little cup of thin ale from a jug under the counter. "Didn't get fined," he says quietly. "But they're watching me now. Next time I don't pass, they'll make an example." He sips the ale and stares at the hearth, where the embers glow like a slow-burning accusation. In a system like this, one mistake doesn't just burn your bread, it burns your name. The next few days, you notice a pattern, one that reveals just how embedded the bread Assize is in every corner of town life. It's not just bakers adjusting their crusts or customers peeking at the bottoms of rolls. It's the way children play with tiny clay loaves in the street, copying their parents' habits. It's how even the town priest grumbles about lighter bread than mercy after Mass. The Assize isn't a rule, it's a mood. And then, one morning, you see it play out again, this time with less mercy. The inspectors arrive early. You follow the sound of boots and barking dogs through the street and find them outside Maud's. Bakery, you remember Maud, the sturdy woman with arms like she could break kindling with her stare. Her shop has always had a good smell, a warm light, and bread that sells out before noon. But not today. The lead inspector holds up a blackened
loaf with a crackled crust and a strangely hollow sound when tapped.
He doesn't look pleased. "This loaf," he announces, "fails the test." Maud doesn't flinch. "My scale is true," she says flatly. "I weighed it myself." The inspector raises an eyebrow. "And your scale was approved when?" Sodul hesitate. That pause is all it takes. He gestures for the iron weights to be brought forward. They measure again, this time in front of a small but growing crowd. You press closer, catching the whispered comments. She always stretches the dough. "That crust's been thin for weeks. Still better than that soggy mess down the lane." The final verdict? The loaf is light by nearly an ounce. She's done. Punishment isn't immediate. First, the scroll. Her name is added, the offence recorded. Then comes the fine, which she can probably scrape together. But worst of all, the order to appear before the town court on market day, and that's where things get theatrical. See, the bread assize wasn't designed to be discreet. It was made to be seen, to deter others, to let everyone know that fairness, however arbitrary, was being maintained. The crowd begins to whisper about the pillory, yes, again. Because for repeat offenders, or when public trust was broken, the pillory wasn't just a maybe, it was practically guaranteed. You trail the gossipers as they drift back into the square. One boy claims to have seen a baker last year with loaves, tied to his limbs while he stood locked in the stocks. Another swears someone once had to eat a whole wheelbarrow of their own bad bread in front of the town. That one's probably a stretch, but in the Middle Ages, humiliation was considered both justice and entertainment. Even more creatively, in a few towns, bakers were marched through the streets holding a rope of underweight loaves around their
necks, a kind of bread necklace of shame. It's funny, until it's you. Back in the bakery, Maud slumps onto a bench. Her daughter tries to clean the flour from the counters, but you can see the hesitation in her hands. Their customers won't. Forget.
People might still buy loaves, but they'll never buy them without comment. Here's a quirky detail from London records. During the 14th century, the bread inspectors didn't just check the bread, they sometimes ordered a public tasting. That's right. A bite of judgment. If the loaf was too sour or too wet, you could be punished just as harshly as if it had been too light. Historians still argue about whether these dramatic punishments were reserved for big cities or whether they were more widespread. Some towns have detailed scrolls of every penalty ever given, others have only oral legends. But one thing is certain, the farther you were from the king's court, the more local flavour the justice system had, and in some places, that flavour was extra salty. Speaking of salt, some bakers, in their quiet rebellion, began forgetting key ingredients. You learn about this from a hushed conversation between two young apprentices who pass by with flour, bags slung over their shoulders. "They say old Benji left the salt out on purpose last week," one whispers. "Why?" "To punish the town. Said if they won't let him sell proper loaves, they can taste what law-abiding bread really means. It's petty, it's poetic, and it works." One customer spits out a chunk of saltless bread on the steps of the church, muttering about laws written by donkeys. Another loudly claims she'll just eat boiled onions instead. Thomas, overhearing it all, just smirks, because secretly, every baker's thought about it. You pause outside the guild hall that afternoon. The Bakers' Guild meets here twice a month, and while it's mostly flour prices and mill updates, today's topic is different. One member has proposed a protest. Nothing violent, just silence. A closed oven day. Every bakery, every hearth, cold for one full day. No bread, no rolls. No scent of yeasty heaven wafting through the streets. It's a bold move, too bold, some argue. What if the Assize retaliates? What if the town blames the bakers? What if the loafless day becomes a week or a jail term? Others are quiet, thoughtful, hopeful even. You slip away before the vote is taken. Because by now you understand. This isn't just about flour and fire. It's
About fear.
about control. And about how, even in a town that survives on bread, the ones who bake it are always walking the line between praise and punishment. And that line is thinner than a crust pulled too soon from the oven. You don't sleep that night. Not really. You keep thinking about Maud's tight-lipped silence, about the way the crowd turned into a pack of whispering hyenas. You dream of loaves stacked like bricks in the shape of a pillory. By the time dawn presses its face to the shutters, you're already outside. You follow the worn grooves in the street, past the market stalls, past Thomas's bakery still shuttered, and right to the square, and there she is. Maud, hands locked in the pillory. A loaf hangs from a rope around her neck, cracked open in the
Middle like a wound. On a stool next to her, someone has placed a small sign painted in crooked black ink. Baker of false weight. It's not the loaf that draws your eye, though.
It's the people. They're not throwing vegetables, not today, but they are watching, whispering. One man makes a comment about too much yeast, not enough honesty, and another laughs a little too loudly. Maud stares straight ahead. You realize she's not embarrassed. She's angry. This is the real punishment, not the ache in her shoulders, not the sun on her neck, not even the sign. It's the assumption that her whole life, her mornings, her skill, her sweat, can be summed up by one moment on a scale that may or may not have been rigged, and she's not the only one. You scan the crowd and see other bakers standing back, arms crossed, Thomas among them. There's a silent understanding between them now, baked slowly over years of inspections and threats. Because the pillory? It's not just a punishment, it's a message. It says, we're watching, and that's what makes it terrifying. Here's a historical oddity for you. Did you know that in some towns, bakers were punished not by pillory, but by being forced to distribute free bread for a week? Sounds kind, right? It wasn't. It usually meant financial ruin. You had to give away dozens of loaves without compensation, sometimes under supervision. And if you couldn't afford to keep baking, you forfeited your stall. Historians still debate whether this form of punishment was more humane or just sneakily devastating. After all, a baker who gives away free bread loses not just money, but credibility. In a market where bread means status, giving it away for nothing makes people suspicious. You follow Thomas back to his bakery once the crowd disperses. He says nothing at first, just lights the oven. The heat rushes out, and for a moment it feels like standing at the mouth of a forge. He pulls out a board of fresh dough, muttering, "I'll double-check every one of these, not because I fear the Assize, but because I fear the silence." You tilt your head. The silence? You ask. He nods. That moment when a customer looks at your loaf and doesn't say anything, doesn't smile, doesn't buy, just walks to someone else. He pauses. That's when you know it's over. Bread is reputation in this town. It's your resume, your handshake, your sermon. If your bread's good, people forgive a lot. If it's bad, even once, they remember. And when the Assize confirms their suspicions, well, that's your public trust charred beyond repair. You spend the afternoon in the bakery with Thomas. He teaches his apprentice how to feel the dough, how to tell when it's wet enough, when it's risen just the right amount. There are no timers, no dials, just instinct and fear. Each loaf is shaped with a little extra dough, just in case. He weighs the first few himself, but eventually stops. Not because he's confident, but because he can't bring himself to look at the scale anymore. Here's a fringe bit of lore. Some bakers would leave small charms or carved symbols in the corners of their bakery, protective marks like those found on old church doors. Historians debate whether these were Christian, pagan, or just nervous habits. Either way, they were a kind of insurance against fire, against mold, and yes, against Assize inspectors. You spot one near Thomas's oven. It's faded, almost rubbed away, but it looks like a four-pointed star scratched into the brick. You ask him about it. My grandfather said it keeps the dough from souring. You don't press further. Some things don't need to be explained. That evening, you help sweep the floor. The fire dies down. The air smells like ash and faint butter. Thomas doesn't say much, but when you leave, he hands you a heel of bread, still warm. You watched.
All day, he says. Might as well taste what fear tastes like. It's not bad, a little too dense, a touch too sour, but honest.
It's late now, and the cobbled streets are slick with the day's sweat. Candlelight flickers behind crooked windows, and just when you think the town has finally exhaled, you hear it. A low clink of bottles, a soft clatter of ceramic. You follow the sound. Inside a narrow house just off the marketplace, there's a small kitchen. A woman stirs something in a blackened pot, the scent rich with barley and herbs. Her sleeves are rolled up, her hands stained from hops. This is not a bakery. This is an alewife's kitchen. You've heard about alewives. Women, often widows or single mothers, who brew ale in their homes to make ends meet. And if you thought the bread assize was strict, wait until you meet its sister, the Assize of ale. Turns out, the Assize didn't just obsess over loaves. It had a thirst for control over anything that passed through your mouth, including ale, which was safer to drink than most water. That made it not just a luxury, but a necessity, and with that necessity came scrutiny. The woman, her name's Ellen, hands you a cup. It's warm, cloudy, and smells like apples gone wild. She raises an eyebrow. No inspectors tonight, she says, half joking. You sip. It's earthy, bitter, oddly satisfying, but there's tension here too. Alewives were often accused of watering down their brews, overcharging, or serving from dirty barrels. Some towns even had ale tasters, officials who walked from house to house, sampling homemade batches to ensure they met quality and price standards. Imagine a job where day drinking was mandatory and legally binding. Here's a quirky fact. One punishment for bad ale was to be dunked in a river on a special contraption called a cucking stool. It looked like a wooden toilet seat on the end of a seesaw. The alewife would be strapped in and dunked repeatedly until the crowd was satisfied, or until she promised never to brew again. Ellen smirks. They tried that on my aunt. Nearly drowned her. Next week, her ale sold out in minutes. You
ask why she still brews, knowing the risks. She shrugs. Because bread pays the rent, but ale keeps people talking.
That's the other truth about this world. Bread fills your belly, but ale fills your table. It's community, conversation, and comfort, especially after a hard week of sour loaves and silent punishments. Historians still debate whether alewives were targeted more because of their brewing or because they were women making money independently. In many towns, their names appeared disproportionately on punishment scrolls, and while the bread assize mostly punished men, the Assize of ale kept
plenty of women in its grip. You help Ellen bottle the last of her batch.
She adds a sprig of herbs to each, her own signature, something between tradition and branding. She doesn't measure it, just feels it, like Thomas with his dough. But unlike him, Ellen keeps one eye on the door. Inspections come after nightfall. Now, she says softly, less public, but more personal. You glance at the back wall. Sure enough, there's a small chalkboard listing prices. Today's ale, 1 penny for a half pint. Tomorrow? Depends on the weather, the hops, the mood of the officials. You thank her and step back into the cool air. Walking past closed shops, you spot an alley where broken barrels lean against a crumbling wall. Someone scratched words into the wood. Watered ale is a sin against Saint Wulfric. You chuckle. There's always a patron saint for something. As you make your way through the slumbering town, you realize the bread assize and the assize of ale aren't just about food or drink, they're about control. How the most ordinary things, bread, beer, flour, water, become levers of power in a world where scarcity is a constant drumbeat. Tomorrow, Ellen might be inspected. Thomas might face another fine. Maud might still have crumbs on her dress from the pillory. But tonight, the bread has been sold, the ale has been poured, and the hearths have cooled. For a few hours at least, the town sleeps. And under the silence lies a world held together not just by law or tradition, but by the fragile bravery of those who dare to bake and brew against the grain. The next morning, you're roused not by church bells or cockcrow, but by the clatter of carts rolling in from the outskirts. The scent of warm yeast drifts into the square before you even open your eyes. The air is cool, but it hums with purpose. Today is market day, and that means more mouths, more coins, and more chances to mess everything up. You follow the crowd toward the center of town, where stalls bloom like mushrooms after a storm. Cloth awnings flap, bakers from neighboring villages have set up trestle tables piled high with loaves, each one carefully displayed like trophies. Flat barley bread, tall rye towers, braided wheat rolls with poppy seeds, a bread lover's paradise. But your eye is drawn to the bakers who keep one loaf behind the table, wrapped in cloth, close to the chest. You ask a merchant why. Official.
Loaf, he says, just in case the assize shows up. That's right. Market day is also prime inspection time, with so many loaves changing hands, so many weights and prices shouted over din and laughter. It's the perfect moment for an
official to catch you slipping. And so every baker here walks the line between confidence and paranoia. They smile big, they advertise boldly, but they keep that one loaf their reference specimen, like a knight keeps a sword. You step up to Thomas's stall. He's here, of course, sleeves rolled, apron fresher than usual. He looks more relaxed than you've seen him in days. Though you suspect it's just performance, you watch as he sells to a fussy nobleman's cook, then to a group of nuns, then to 2 barefoot children who pool coins for one crusty round. Each time he checks the weight, mutters the price aloud, and offers a practiced nod. Then a hush spreads through the crowd. A man in a blue surcoat, hair slicked back with church oil, and hands clasped behind his back, begins walking stall to stall. His assistant carries a scroll. You know that walk, Assize inspector, but this one is different. He's not weighing loaves, he's asking questions. How much flour was used in this batch? Did you bake before sunrise? Where did your grain come from? You drift close enough to hear his soft voice reach Thomas's table. Your bread, he says, has a pleasant colour. But some say you've switched mills, Thomas nods. Aye, the old one's stone cracked last week. I buy from Eastgate now. And the price of that flour? 3 pennies more per sack. The inspector makes a small noise, disapproval, or indigestion, you can't tell. He doesn't check weights, he doesn't even touch the loaves. He just says, if the flour costs more and your prices haven't changed, then what changed in the bread? Thomas goes still. The answer, of course, is, I'm losing money. But he doesn't say that. He simply lifts a loaf, tears it open and hands the chunk to the inspector. It's a calculated risk the man chews. Slowly, deliberately. Then, without a word, moves on. Thomas slumps onto his stool the moment they're out of sight. Here's a strange tidbit. In some towns, the inspectors were actually local bakers, appointed to judge their rivals. You can imagine how well that went. Bias, bribery, petty vengeance, all baked into the system like raisins in a bad pudding. Historians still argue whether this decentralized approach fostered corruption or just created a more authentic form of justice. What's certain is that it made the rules both omnipresent and maddeningly inconsistent. You circle the market now, noting subtle tactics. Some bakers shape their loaves into ornate patterns, hoping beauty distracts from weight. Others shout, buy 10, get 1 free, using clever math to bypass the price rules. A few offer free samples, tiny crusty wedges, meant to win loyalty before a customer even asks about cost. And then you spot something odd. A baker with a long table,
full of perfect loaves,
but no buyers. You ask why, an old woman mutters, last week his bread failed the scale. Assize didn't pillory him, but they listed him. Name's on the wall now. You walk over. Sure enough, near the town notice board, there's a short, parchment nailed in place. Names, weights, dates, fines, a public ledger of shame. It's not flashy like the pillory, not theatrical like the dunking stool, but it sticks, and customers, especially the old ones, remember. The baker in question tries to smile when you meet his eye. Fresh loaves, he offers. Clean flour, no tricks, but it's too late. Reputation, once frayed, is hard to weave back together. As the market winds down, you find Thomas again, packing up unsold rounds and wiping sweat from his neck. Good day, you ask. He shrugs. Good enough. No fines, no questions, I couldn't
answer. Then he pauses. But I lost 2 old customers. Saw 'em head to Maud's stall instead. Maud, released from pillory, selling bread with a bruise, still healing across her temple, and still gaining customers. Because if you survive
the shame, sometimes you get a strange kind of fame. Infamy, really. But in a town like this, even bad bread can become a brand. The market is over now, but the stories baked into it linger like the scent of scorched crust. As the stalls are folded and the last of the flour is swept into gutters, you walk with Thomas down a quieter lane, past rows of shuttered shops and
half-sleeping dogs. His basket thuds softly against his hip. A single unsold loaf inside. Do you know why we give 13 for the price of 12? He asks suddenly. You nod. Fear? He grins faintly. Exactly. The baker's dozen that
13th loaf isn't kindness, it's insurance. A quiet bribe to the gods of regulation. It began, so the stories say, during the height of the Assize, when punishments were sharp and loaves were carefully eyed for any hint of short weight. 1 ounce off, and you'd be in the stocks with breadcrumbs in your beard. So bakers began adding an extra loaf to every dozen, just in case. Better to lose a little dough than your reputation, or your ability to choose solid food. The superstition stuck. Even today, the phrase survives in language, though few remember why. Thomas drops the last loaf into the hands of a stable boy. No.
Coin is exchanged. Just a nod, maybe guilt, maybe charity, maybe fear of waste. Bread shouldn't be currency, Thomas mutters, but it always is. And he's not wrong. You pass the town mill, a squat stone building where grain is ground into flour. A boy leans out the window shouting down prices for next week. They've risen. Again. The rain last month ruined half the barley, and the merchants have already started hoarding. Thomas stops walking. I'll have to start mixing again, he says quietly. You raise an eyebrow. Pea flour, he adds. Coarser, but it stretches the sack. People complain it tastes grassy, but better grass than nothing.
You ask if the Assize allows it. He shakes his head. They don't ask what's in the loaf, only what it weighs. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. Some bakers took this ambiguity as permission. They experimented with everything from crushed legumes to old breadcrumbs, from beer mash to potato starch in later centuries. If it puffed up in the oven and passed the scale, it was bread. You trail your fingers along the wall of the alley as you walk. Faint grooves are carved into the bricks here, tally marks maybe. Counting fines, failed batches, it's hard to tell. You arrive at a different bakery now, one you haven't visited yet. It's run by a man named Will. Tall, cheerful, and, most importantly, new. He moved to town just last month, inherited the building from a cousin. His bread? Beautiful, crisp crust, pale golden interiors, artfully folded knots and braids. His stall was mobbed at market day. People raved. Thomas watches him from across the street. Looks like art, he says. Tastes like vanity. You ask if he's jealous. No, Thomas replies. I'm suspicious. And here's why. Will doesn't seem to fear the Assize. He doesn't display the price chart outside. He never weighs loaves in public. And when an inspector stopped by briefly earlier today, Will offered him an apple tart and a mug of ale before anyone could say, iron weights. It's subtle, polite, but obvious. You learn later that Will's cousin was once an Assize clerk, which explains a lot. You see, even in a system built on fear and fairness, connections still mattered. The right family name, the right donation. To the guild, the right bottle passed under the table. These could buy leniency. Historians still argue whether these soft corners made the system more human or simply more corrupt. But for bakers like Thomas, it meant living by the rules while others danced around them. That night, you sit by the hearth as Thomas slices into a test loaf. It's darker than usual, speckled with coarse flour and something faintly green. Peas, maybe. You take a bite. It's, okay, not great, but nourishing. Honest. He watches you chew, then asks, do you think it's better to bake good bread and be punished, or bake bad bread and be praised? You chew for a moment longer. Depends who's doing the praising, you answer. Each nods slowly. The hearth crackles. Later, as you drift into sleep on the spare cot in the back room, you hear Thomas whispering a prayer, not to a saint or a god, but to the oven itself. A quiet promise of consistency, of not failing, of surviving.
One more week.
The next morning begins with thunder. Not the sky-splitting, earth-shaking kind, but the rolling wooden kind, a wagon clattering over cobblestones, heaped with sacks of grain, and driven by a man whose voice booms louder than any church bell. Obviously,
Fire in Eastgate, he shouts. Price is up again. If you haven't got your flour yet, best you pray to St. Honoratus. That catches everyone's attention. Flour is the spine of the baker's week. If the price spikes, if the supply wavers,
everything crumbles, sometimes literally. You hurry to Thomas's bakery, finding him already deep in math he's doing in his head, using his finger to mark invisible numbers on the flour-dusted countertop. I knew it, he mutters. 3 weeks without rain, then a thunderstorm, and now the mill's gone half to ash. He slams the counter, sending a puff of flour into the air. This week's bread won't even cover the cost of the firewood. That's the unbearable part of the bread assize. Price control without supply control. The town dictates how much a loaf must weigh and how much it must sell for, but it doesn't guarantee that the ingredients will actually be affordable. You follow Thomas to the grain merchant's stall. The mood is sharp. Everyone's angling. For the best flour, for the whitest, for anything that isn't dusty and grey, there's pushing, elbowing. Someone's child nearly gets knocked into a barrel, and the merchant? He's enjoying this. First come, first served, he sings, unless you're willing to pay a bit more. Thomas doesn't flinch. He counts his pennies, stares down the man, and takes his place in line. You watch as some bakers pay double for flour that used to cost pennies a sack. Others buy cracked wheat or barley or whatever the mice haven't claimed. Everyone is worried. Here's a quirky footnote from the 14th century. During extreme grain shortages, some towns allowed emergency bread, coarse, dark, nearly stone-like loaves sold at reduced prices. These were known as black bread, and though they filled the stomach, they were considered low-class food, fit only for servants and beggars. And yet, sometimes black bread was the only thing that saved a community from starvation. Thomas returns with a small sack and a sour expression. "This'll get me through 4 days," he mutters. "After that, I'm selling rolls the size of teacups." You help him unload the flour. It's not great quality. There's chaff still mixed in, and it smells vaguely metallic. Probably
Milled in a rush, Thomas doesn't curse. He doesn't whine. He just nods once and begins measuring. That's how it works here. Crisis hits.
you bake anyway, and while you watch him knead the dough, a stiffer, lumpier mix than usual, you realize that the real secret behind medieval bread wasn't flour or fire or even fear. It was adaptation. Historians still argue whether bakers were artisans or survivors, whether they clung to tradition or pioneered quiet revolutions in recipe, technique, and shape. But the more time you spend in this flour-caked shop, the more obvious the truth becomes. They were both. You ask Thomas what he'll do if the flour runs out before the next shipment. He doesn't answer at first, just dusts his hands and says, "I'll borrow," or beg, or bake something smaller. Then quieter, "But I won't stop." He points to the wall behind the hearth where an old parchment hangs crooked. It's a faded copy of the local Assize table, dated 5 years ago. The ink has run in places, the numbers are outdated, but Thomas keeps it there, visible. "A reminder?" you ask. "A joke?" he says. A joke so old, no one laughs anymore. That night, the fire flickers lower than usual. The loaves are smaller, harder, but still warm. Still made with care. You chew one thoughtfully and think about how, in another town, in another time, this would be called famine bread. Here it's just Monday. Before bed, Thomas wraps one of the rougher loaves in cloth and places it on the window ledge. "For the widow down the road," he says. "Can't pay, won't ask." You nod, and you understand now. The bread Assize may control the loaves, but it never managed to control the bakers' hearts. It's a feast day, not one of the big ones. No saints with names anyone remembers, no parades, no fattened geese, just a middle-tier celebration with music, extra candles, and the mayor strutting around in his least wrinkled tunic. But still, a feast is a feast, which means more bread, lots more. You wake to the sound of bells, dogs barking, and bakers shouting over one another. Flour clouds the air like battlefield smoke. Thomas is already elbow-deep in dough, moving faster than you've ever seen him. There's no time to talk, only time to bake, because on feast days the rules bend, and sometimes they snap. The bread Assize still applies technically, but nobody's checking. The inspectors are busy with ceremonial duties or too drunk on sweet mead to wield their iron weights with accuracy. Customers are less fussy. They want bread shaped like doves. Bread stuffed with fruit. Bread dusted with cinnamon. Bless us all. Thomas has 3 apprentices today, not counting you. One rolls the dough, one mans the fire. The third wraps warm loaves in strips of cloth printed with holy symbols. Presentation matters. People want miracles with their supper. But the real miracle, getting through the day without collapsing. You step outside where the square is buzzing. There are puppet shows, jugglers, even a man pretending to be a saint who throws stale bread into the crowd. Children cheer. Adults grumble it's last week's rye, and then you see it. A loaf on a pedestal. Golden, enormous, flanked by 2 guards like a jewel. This is the ceremonial loaf, an offering from the Baker's Guild to the mayor's table. Supposedly the perfect bread. Balanced, seasoned, baked with flour from 3 different mills. You nudge Thomas. Did you make that? He laughs. No one made it. Not really. Every baker added something. I think I just shaped the crust. Does it meet the Assize? He smirks. Absolutely not. And there's the heart of it. On feast days, everyone cheats. Here's a fun historical tidbit. In some towns, feast loaves were deliberately oversized, not to be eaten, but to symbolize abundance. They'd be paraded through streets, sometimes, with coins or ribbons baked into the middle, and then given to the poorest child in the village. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Some Assize clerks complained that feast loaves blurred the standard, encouraging everyday bakers to stray from the path of lawful proportion. Historians still debate whether feast days helped loosen the bread Assize's iron grip, or simply offered temporary illusions of freedom. But to the bakers, they were a breath of hot, buttery air. You help carry trays of sweet buns down the street to the church. On feast days, Thomas bakes extras. These aren't for sale, they're for grace. He calls it baking forgiveness. Give enough bread to the right cleric, and maybe your next inspection goes easier. You ask if that's fair. He shrugs. Fair doesn't keep ovens hot. Later, you spot Maud again. Her eyes still bruised from her pillory stint, but she's laughing now, selling little twists of dough shaped like stars. People seem eager to forgive her, or maybe they just missed her bread. In the afternoon, it starts to rain. Light, warm, brief, just enough to make the stones shine. The feast goes on. Children race with crusts in their fists. A priest sings a hymn with crumbs in his beard. An old man naps beside a cooling basket of rolls, smiling in his sleep. And through it all, the bread Assize is nowhere to be seen. There are no scales, no scrolls, no iron weights today.
Only loaves, dozens of them. Imperfect, uneven, underpriced, overbaked, but loved. And yet, Thomas doesn't relax. As the sun sets and the last of the fire dies down, he sits on the steps of his bakery and looks out over the fading laughter. Tomorrow, he says, tomorrow they'll remember, tomorrow they'll measure again, because the bread Assize is like a stone in the shoe. You can dance for a while, you can even forget it's there, but sooner or later you limp. The morning after the feast feels like waking up with a hangover you didn't earn. The town is quieter now, sluggish. Bits of pastry litter the square like edible confetti. The air smells faintly of burnt sugar and regret. You pass a man sweeping crusts into the gutter while muttering about heathens stuffing raisins into everything. Thomas opens the bakery slowly today. His movements are stiff, his eyes shadowed. Nothing sells after a feast, he mutters. Bellies are full,
Wallets are empty, and everyone blames the bread for their stomach aches. You help him set out the loaves anyway. Not many, just a modest row of brown rounds and 2 rye plats. Nothing festive, nothing fancy, just functional. And then a tap on the doorframe. You both turn to see a man in a dark, hooded cloak. No.
Scroll. No iron weights. Just a smile and a pouch. He steps inside without waiting for an invitation. Thomas stiffens.
You catch the twitch of muscle along his jaw. This is no inspector, this is something worse. He places the pouch on the counter and unties it. Coins, silver ones. Then, from his cloak, a folded slip of parchment. A symbol on the back you don't recognize. But Thomas does. Guild treasurer, he murmurs, voice low. And collector. The guild, it turns out, isn't just flower jokes and ceremonial loaves. It has teeth, and it bites softly with debts. You were fined last year, the man says, tapping the coins. And you paid, but you didn't pay the guild tax on the fine. That wasn't a rule then, Thomas replies. It is now. This is the other side of the bread assize, the corruption baked right into the crust. Because while the inspectors enforce the law, the guild enforces the unwritten law. Fees for late payments, taxes on flour storage, security contributions for oven repairs that never come, and when all else fails, the quiet threat of exclusion. If you're removed from the guild, the man adds, you'll lose your right to sell in the square. No scroll, no stocks, just silence. You watch Thomas count out coins from a tin buried beneath sacks of barley flour. Each one clinks like a dropped hammer. When the pouch is full again, the treasurer smiles, bows slightly, and slips back into the street. You sit for a while after he's gone. Finally, Thomas speaks. I spend half my life obeying the law, he says. The other half surviving the people who enforce it. Here's a fringe historical fact. In some towns, bread guilds were more feared than the local courts. They could control who baked, when they baked, even what type of flour was legal to use. Want to add oats to your recipe? Better hope the guild approves. Otherwise, no license, no oven, no livelihood. Historians still argue whether guilds protected bakers from the state or simply added another layer of bureaucracy. But the stories they left behind suggest that power, not justice, was often the main ingredient. You ask Thomas if he's ever considered leaving the guild. He laughs. And go where? There's not a village left in England without a guild watching its ovens. You think about that as you help him finish the day's batch. The loaves are heavier than usual, made with denser flour, likely from a cheaper mill. He adds extra water, lets them rise longer, punches them once with surprising force. When they come out of the oven, they look perfect. And yet, he slices one open, sees a small hollow near the center, and sighs. They'll say I cheated, he
says, but you didn't.
I know that, you know that. But a hollow in the loaf? That's suspicion. And suspicion spreads faster than mold. He adds an extra roll to each customer's order that day. Not generosity, insurance. He's back to the baker's dozen again. You catch Maud in the afternoon. She's bought a new apron, still bruised, but now selling tiny flatbreads she calls blister cakes. They're cheaper, faster, harder to accuse of lightness. She leans over and mutters, "Saw the guildman visit you." Thomas nods. She spits, gracefully, and far from the bread. "Fines are one thing," she says, "but bribes dressed as dues, that's rot." You watch as a few other bakers drift over. Quiet murmurs, shared glances, a little knot of unrest beginning to form. Later you pass the notice board again. This time there's a new parchment. All guild bakers must display weight slates and pricing scrolls by week's end. No signature, just a seal, a reminder the bread assize never sleeps. and neither do the ones who benefit most from enforcing it. By now you're fluent in the town's dialect of dread. You can tell when an inspector is coming by how fast the apprentices sweep the floors. You can tell when flour prices rise by the slump in Thomas's shoulders, and you can tell, just from the scent in the air, whether the loaves that day are hopeful or resigned. But today, something is off. Not anxious, not tense, just quiet. No carts, no laughter, no shouting vendors. Even the dogs seem subdued. You spot a few townsfolk gathered in the square, not moving, just reading the notice board in silence. You drift closer. A small scroll has been tacked up overnight. By order of the magistrate, the baking and sale of bread is suspended in the village of Kenwell until further notice. Ongoing investigation into fraudulent grain use and repeated
violations of the bread Assize. Thomas reads it over your shoulder. Kenwell's just 2 miles north. You ask if he knows anyone there. Half the millers at market. My brother-in-law used to bake there. He doesn't say more. He doesn't need to. A village-wide ban. You walk with him through town where rumours fly faster than loaves at a festival.
Some say Kenwell bakers were using powdered bone in their flour. Others whisper about bribes, mouldy grain, loaves baked with stones inside to pass weight. Someone claims an inspector was poisoned. No one really knows. But that doesn't stop the stories, and the message is clear. Cross the Assize too many times and they'll shut you down entirely. Not just fines, not just pillories. Oblivion. You reach the edge of town where a trader from Kenwell stands beside an empty cart. His bread was confiscated at the gate. He holds a sign hastily scribbled in charcoal. Will trade tools for flour. Thomas offers him
a half sack. No charge. The man takes it without a word, but the look in his eyes is the kind that never fully leaves. Back in the bakery, Thomas double-checks the weights, then triple-checks, then checks again. Won't be me next, he mutters. You
sit in the back room watching him knead. His rhythm is harsher today, faster, more like a man trying to work something out of the dough. Guilt, fear, fury. You ask him what happens if a town loses its bread for more than a few days. He doesn't stop kneading. They riot. That's not exaggeration. In London in the 1250s, bread shortages led to public chaos. People smashed bakery windows. Mobs hunted down suspected hoarders. Even millers were chased out of towns for failing to deliver flour. Bread wasn't just food, it was stability. When the loaves stopped, society cracked. Historians still argue whether the bread Assize prevented famine or merely masked its symptoms. It gave the illusion of control. But in times of crisis, bad harvests, corrupt officials, or sudden bans, it often collapsed under its own weight. You hear later that Kenwell's ban has already sparked protest. Their local guild has been dissolved, all baking equipment seized. Anyone caught baking, even in their own hearth, faces imprisonment. Thomas adds a second lock to his storeroom that night, just in case. Here's a strange historical tidbit. In some regions, when bread laws grew too harsh, black markets for illegal bread popped up. Loaves sold from baskets in alleyways, coarse rolls swapped for root vegetables, even underground bakeries, literal clandestine ovens hidden beneath homes. Bread became contraband. You ask Thomas if that could happen here. Already has, he says, nodding toward the alley beside his shop. Maud's been baking her blister cakes late at night. No official records, no taxes, and no proof they even qualify as bread. You smile. That's clever. He looks grave. That's
dangerous.
And he's right. The Assize doesn't just punish with weights and fines, it punishes with suspicion. with whispers, with scrolls nailed in the dark. If they believe you're operating outside their system, they don't just ban you, they erase you. The next day, a wagon rolls through town, not with flour, but with ashes. Kenwell's ovens, you're told, were smashed and burned by order of the magistrate. The ashes are to be scattered as a reminder, no names, no faces, just soot where bread once rose. Thomas doesn't speak. That evening, he just bakes, silently, carefully, every loaf shaped with almost religious precision, as if to say, I'm still here. The ovens are hotter today, not just from fire, but from tension. You notice it in the way Thomas sets the logs. Too precisely, too quietly. Each movement like a practiced ritual. Stack, light, wait, knead. No whistling, no idle flour jokes. The bakery hums with the kind of silence that makes you want to whisper, even when no one's around. You glance at the flour sack, half empty again. The price has gone up again. No surprise there. Merchants from nearby towns are gouging, using the fear from Kenwell's closure as leverage. Bake right or not at all, they say. But what they mean is pay more or go hungry. Thomas starts shaping the first batch. It's a small one, just enough to meet the scroll's requirements. You ask if he's planning to sell less. He shakes his head. Planning to sell it faster. Why? Because word has it, the inspectors are doubling back. Not just checking weights, but looking for connections. To Kenwell, shared millers, shared recipes, shared sympathies. One baker from the next town over was fined simply for using Kenwell-style crust scoring. Crust scoring! A flourish of the knife now deemed suspicious. You help Thomas tidy the front of the shop. He scrapes old dough from the counter's edge while muttering numbers under his breath. Weights, flour ratios, profit margins, so thin they could slice a finger. Then the bell over the bakery door rings. Not an inspector, a boy. He's maybe 8. Dusty knees, clutching a copper coin so tight it's left an imprint on his palm. He looks up with wide eyes. Dar says we can only buy one today, he says. But we're 4. Thomas blinks, looks at you, then back at the boy. He wraps a full-sized loaf in cloth, adds 2 small rolls and hands them over. The boy stares at the bundle, stunned. Tell your Dar it was buy 1, get 3, Thomas says. Just for today, the boy runs out, leaving behind a puff of street dust and a silence thicker than ash. You ask why. Thomas doesn't look up. Because we can't all wait for permission to be decent. It's not the first time he's given away bread. But today it feels different, riskier. Here's an obscure detail from city records. During periods of unrest, bakers were warned not to be too generous, lest they be accused of distorting the market or provoking dependency. A loaf given freely was seen not as charity, but as rebellion. Historians still argue whether this paranoia was about economic stability or just fear of losing control. After all, a baker who feeds without sanction feeds outside the system. And to the Assize, that's treason in crust form. Thomas bakes another round. You help with the rising, the shaping, the scoring. This time, he lets you decide the flour to water ratio. You hesitate. Not because you don't know, but because it suddenly feels sacred. This is more than bread. This is witness. He nods at your mix. Risky, but brave. You both laugh, the sound cracked like a hard crust but warm beneath. That night, he shares a rumor. The Bakers' Guild is being watched, not officially. No scrolls, no accusations, but a man in grey has been seen lingering outside the guild hall. Another
outside the mill. Another beside this very bakery. You remember him now?
A man chewing a raw turnip, watching your window for nearly an hour. Secret watch, Thomas mutters. They think we're planning something. You ask if you are. Not yet, he says. But fear can make even silence look like conspiracy. You can't tell if he's joking. The shop closes early, not from lack of business, but from a shared breath being held. He boards the window shutters tonight, not because of thieves, because flour has become more valuable than silver, and trust, even
rarer. You pass the mill on your walk home. There are guards now, real ones, with padded cloaks and staves.
not to protect the workers, but to keep them from smuggling flour to bakeries like Thomas's. The air smells of damp grain and smoke. As you turn the corner, you spot Maud slipping a sack into a cart under cover of tarp. Illegal flour? Maybe just old barley, but you don't say a word. Because now you understand. The bread Assize doesn't just weigh loaves, it weighs loyalty. And increasingly, it finds everyone a little too light. By now, the entire town moves like it's being watched, not just by the Assize officials, but by each other. You step into the square and feel it, paranoia thick as bread dough left too long to rise. People glance over shoulders, speak in half sentences. The bakers who used to boast about crumb softness now speak only in weight and price. No one jokes about sourdough anymore. Thomas doesn't talk much either. He bakes before dawn, serves before lunch, and locks the door before dusk. He keeps fewer loaves on display, no samples, no gifts, no crusts left on the sill for birds. You ask if it's worth it. Still baking, still submitting to a system that seems to punish more than protect. He leans on the oven and wipes sweat from his brow. If
I stop baking, I vanish, he says.
And if I vanish, so does this street, so does this town. He's not being poetic, he's being practical. Bread isn't a luxury, it's the foundation. Stop the bread, and everything else goes sideways, and everyone knows it, including the officials, which is why they're tightening the net. The scroll posted that morning announces new checks, not just of loaves, but of flour ledgers. Inspectors want to know exactly how much grain bakers buy, how much they use, how many loaves they're baking, and where each coin goes. They're not just weighing the bread, they're weighing lives. You follow Thomas to the Guildhall that afternoon. It's the first meeting in weeks. The room is small, hot, and full of flour-streaked tunics and suspicious eyes. Maud is there, her blister cakes more popular than ever. So is Will, the charming outsider with perfect crusts and suspiciously clean fingernails. The meeting is called to order by a short, balding man whose voice sounds like dry parchment. "We are under review," he says, simply. No details, no comfort. He says inspectors may begin baking with them, random spot checks of their process, flour weights, rise times, even firewood usage. Will chuckles. What next? They'll ask to inspect the yeast? Nobody laughs. Maud stands. "We should shut the ovens, just for a day. Show them what the town is like without us." A murmur rises. Thomas doesn't speak, but you can feel him thinking. Here's a bizarre but true detail from medieval France. In one documented case, an entire baker's district staged a silent protest by baking loaves that were perfectly legal, but comically small. Tiny legal loaves sold at full price met every law, but humiliated the system. The protest lasted 1 week. By the end, the magistrates had issued 3 scrolls of clarification and 2 official apologies. Historians still argue whether this was civic brilliance or passive-aggressive genius, but in this town such boldness would be seen as rebellion. Treason by bread. Back at the Guildhall, the vote is called. shut the ovens or keep baking. 8 votes for protest, 6 votes against, 3 abstain, including Thomas. Outside, the sun is beginning to sink. You walk with him back to the bakery. You could have changed the vote, you say. I could have, he nods, but I won't.
Tell Maud to bake for free, and I won't tell Will to close his shop when he's just trying to stay above water. He unlocks the door. The bakery smells like rye and ash. I hate the Assize, he says, but we're not fighting flour.
We're fighting hunger, and hunger fights dirty. You help him prep the dough for the next day. Smaller batch, coarser flour.
No wheat left? Peas and barley, he mutters. Even the rats are frowning at it. Still he needs it, like he's sculpting truth into every loaf. Then a knock at the back door. Soft, deliberate. Thomas answers. It's a young woman.
You recognize her from the market, the one who always buys 2 loaves and tucks them into her shawl. But tonight, she doesn't ask for bread. She hands over a note. No signature, just 4 words. We bake at midnight. Thomas folds it and puts it in his pocket. You don't ask what it means. You already know. The system may be ironclad, but heat rises. And when enough bakers reach their boiling point, even the bread Assize might start to crack. Midnight. The town is silent except for the wind, which whistles through shutters like it's trying not to be caught. The streets shine faintly in the moonlight, wet from an earlier drizzle, slick and empty. Except for one thing, the smell of baking. You follow it just as Thomas does, moving like ghosts through alleyways. It's not coming from his bakery, not Maud's, not Will's either. It's deeper, off the main street, past the old well, into a crumbling stone building that once served as a tannery and now holds something far more sacred, an illegal oven. Inside, the heat is sharp and dry, the kind that clings to your skin and doesn't let go. There are 4 bakers working fast, silently, shaping, scoring, brushing, sliding loaves into the glowing mouth of the fire. One of them nods at Thomas, another hands you a bucket of flour, points to the bench. No words, just work. This is the midnight bake. You'd heard rumours, everyone had, that somewhere in the town a group of bakers had built their own oven, shared their grain, and baked loaves not for profit or for show, but for people, for the hungry, for the overlooked, for those who'd fallen through the cracks of the Assize. You slice dough, brush crusts, catch your breath, only between turns of the paddle. It's exhilarating, it's terrifying, because this is treason. If the Assize finds out, it's not just fines, it's jail, or worse. They could revoke your license, confiscate your tools, label you a baker of the black ovens, and from that day on, no one would ever buy your bread again. But here's the truth, no scroll can erase. People are hungry, and the bread Assize has become a gatekeeper for justice instead of a guardian of it. You help load the cooling loaves into baskets. They're not pretty, flat, uneven, made with barley and lentil flour, but they smell like home, like hope. Then the baskets are distributed, 1 per district, carried by hand to doors that open just long enough to pull them inside. By dawn, there will be crumbs on every stoop. But no witnesses. You slip out just before the first rooster crows back to Thomas's bakery, where he locks the door behind you and doesn't speak for a long time. Finally he says, "We baked 57 loaves." You nod. Then he adds, "And none of them were weighed." There's something freeing in that, liberating, but also dangerous. You ask if he plans to do it again. He doesn't answer, but he starts prepping flour. Here's a curious historical footnote. In some towns, night bakers became legends, anonymous providers who left loaves at poorhouses, orphanages, or churches. Some believe these were wealthy citizens seeking penance. Others claim they were just regular bakers, tired of injustice. We'll never know. Historians still argue whether the midnight bake movements were organized rebellion or just small acts of resistance stitched together by desperation. Either way, they became mythic. Soft, warm proof that not all rules deserve obedience. That day, the inspectors do visit. They don't enter the bakery. They just stand outside, scribble in their ledger, and move on. But the tension remains. And now you see it everywhere. Maud starts keeping her flour in 2 barrels, one labelled, one hidden. Will begins mixing dough before sunset and baking before sunrise, never explaining why his shelves are full by dawn. Other bakers begin asking careful questions at the mill. Who else bought flour this week? Did the guild check the scales? Has the mayor's wife stopped buying bread again? The bread underground has begun to rise. You can feel it. It's not violent, not loud, but it's spreading, yeast-like, through every crack in the system, and maybe, just maybe, it's enough. That night, you find Thomas standing by the hearth again, holding a single unbaked loaf. He places it gently in the coals.
Lets it sit. Burns. He says nothing. But when it's blackened and split, he lifts it out and lays it on the counter. Some bread isn't meant to be eaten, he murmurs. Some is just a reminder. You look at it, charred, cracked, useless, and yet honest.
The day begins with no bells, no announcements, no scrolls on the board, just silence. You sense it before you see it, the strange calm. Bakers still light their ovens, flour still puffs through the air, but no one talks, not loudly, not with joy. Something has changed. You step into the bakery. Thomas is already there, pulling loaves from the oven. They're shaped differently, longer, flatter, easier to stack. You notice he's baking more today. Not just more loaves, but more types. Oat rounds, bean cakes, even a few sweet buns. The smell is rich, comforting, risky. He says, "No one's coming today." You blink. What? No inspectors, no guild reps, no collectors. You ask how he knows. He lifts a small folded note from the counter. No seal. Just 5 words, inked in a hurry. The Assize is suspended, temporarily. A merchant brought it with the morning flour. Your mind races. Suspended? Why? For how long? No one knows. Maybe too many complaints. Maybe unrest in nearby towns. Maybe a magistrate got sick eating a stale roll. Whatever the reason, the bread Assize has, for the moment, paused. And the town doesn't know what to do. Some bakers celebrate. You see Will dancing in his shop, tossing flour into the air like confetti. Others are cautious. Maud says it feels like the sky holding its breath. But Thomas, he keeps baking. He doesn't raise his prices, doesn't change his recipes. He just bakes, steady as always. You ask why. He shrugs, because the bread doesn't care. Here's a strange historical note. During times of plague or civil unrest, some towns did suspend the bread Assize, not out of mercy, but out of necessity. With no inspectors able to travel, the laws were impossible to enforce. And in those windows of freedom, many bakers chose to uphold the standards anyway. Not because they had to, but because they believed in the loaf. Historians still debate whether the temporary collapses of the Assize were blessings or just preludes to greater chaos. But one thing is certain. Every time the rules returned, they returned harder. That's what Thomas fears. He says, the weight of a loaf doesn't change just because the scales are missing. You watch him mark today's bread with a notch. His own sign, his own system. He writes the flour weight in chalk beside each one, not because anyone told him to, but because someone might ask, someday. The bakery fills with customers, more than usual. Word spreads fast. No Assize today. People laugh again. Coins change hands more freely. Someone even tips, but not everyone is cheerful. At the Guildhall, a group of bakers argues. One wants to raise prices immediately. Another wants to bake smaller, loaves. One woman asks if she can finally mix lentils into everything and call it artisan. The treasurer says nothing. He's just staring at the empty spot on the wall where the Assize scroll used to hang. Later, Maud leans against Thomas's doorway. She's holding a tiny blackened loaf from the illegal oven. "You started something," she says. "I just needed dough." "Yeah," she replies, "but with purpose." You step outside and look up at the sky. It's cloudy again, the kind of clouds that mean either rain or nothing at all, and that's when you realize the real weight wasn't on the bread, it was on the people. The Assize didn't just measure flour and coin, it measured fear, control, trust. And now, for the first time in generations, the town is learning what it means to bake without fear. For now. Because tomorrow the scroll might return. Tomorrow the iron weights might clink on the counter again. But today the bread belongs to the bakers, and as you sit by the oven's warm glow, watching Thomas slice a heel from a golden brown loaf, you know this moment, this rare, quiet moment of enough, is worth everything. Word count, 1098, wind down, 300 words. The fire burns low now, the loaves have cooled, the flour has settled. And the night presses gently against the shutters of the bakery, soft as wool, steady as breath. You're tired, not just from walking the streets, or hauling sacks, or tending fire, but from witnessing the weight, not just in ounces, but in responsibility. You watched as bread became a currency, a contract, a confession. You saw how a loaf too light could break a man, how fear could seep through flour like water into dough, and how the quiet strength of those who kneaded with care, despite it all, could rise into something warm and whole. Tonight, the town sleeps, the scrolls are down, the inspectors are gone, but the ovens still glow, and the scent of honest bread lingers like a blessing no one dares name. Let that be your final thought as you drift, slowly, safely, into sleep. Not the fines, not the pillories, not the parchment, but the hands, the ones that shaped dough by moonlight, the ones that weighed flour with trembling hope, the ones that passed warm rolls to a hungry child and said, "Just this once, don't worry about the coin." In those hands lived quiet rebellion, and in their loaves a promise that even when rules fall heavy and hearts grow hollow, someone, somewhere, will still rise before dawn and bake. Sweet dreams.